which is our largest funding initiative, as many of you know who have applied or know about ITVS. It happens twice a year. And I'm really happy to be here to try to answer questions right on the eve of our deadline, which is coming up on Friday. So if you're preparing your materials, remember to get them in there by 5 o'clock California time. So I'm going to try to answer as many questions as I can during the next 55 minutes or so. I'm not quite sure how long this is going, but we're waiting for the first questions to come up, and we're going to get right at it. I would ask that you try not to ask questions that are too specific to your project. I would actually invite you, if you have some specific concerns about your project, that you can email me, and I will try to answer them. In terms of general questions about eligibility, does it meet the ITVS mission, that kind of thing. You want questions that will benefit as many people as possible in terms of their response. So we'll hopefully be coming up on some questions pretty soon. And okay, so here comes the first question, which I will be reading. This is actually a comment from Enrique. It's a very general question dealing with the treatment. The treatment, of course, is what I would consider the main part of the proposal. It's where you lay out your story. It's what I call the director's vision laid out on paper. The treatment in theory is really what the completed film potentially will look like. So it's a very important part of the proposal, probably the most important part, I would say, in this first part of the review process. Enrique wants to know, how can we write a treatment for a 1-hour documentary within 3 pages? I thought treatments were supposed to describe the content of the actual film. Should this be more like a film approach than a treatment? I'm confused and stuck. My 10-minute work in progress is better than anything I could write, but I feel that if I don't write the treatment like a pro, that ITVS will not consider my proposal. Please give some guidance. That's a really good question. It's one that, we talk to producers, filmmakers a lot about. We do workshops, in fact, about the treatment. It's really important because most of the projects we get are still in production, either in the early phase of production or mid phase, and yet you're asking for, technically you're asking for completion funds. So we need to get as much of a sense of what the final film may look like, given all the vagaries of, telling a story that's true. Things change. So the treatment really lays out the story from beginning, middle to end. So 3 pages is actually a lot. When you think about pitches, for example, verbal pitches, you get 2 to 3 minutes to pitch a 1-hour documentary. So think of the treatment as a sort of a written pitch. And one important thing to remember, or 3 important things actually, are you have to have a strong premise. The premise, of course, is the whole basis for your story. It basically states in 2 or 3 lines at the most in the premise just what the story is about and what the unique point of view is that you're going to be conveying and telling this story. The premise is really sort of the building, the first building block of your project. Without a really strong, robust premise, the rest of your project could be in trouble. So I really put a lot of emphasis on having a really strong premise. So starting with the premise, once you lay that out, then you begin to tell the story. You begin to use a very visual, active language, if you will, to describe the story as it unfolds. If it's a character-driven documentary, you describe the character and make that person come to life on the page. Remember to include a structure. Many people use a 3-act structure. You can lay out the structure in 3 acts if you want, and within each act you tell us basically what's going to happen. You want to convey in the treatment a sense of what I call narrative momentum, or or a dynamic quality to your story in the treatment. It's like a well-written short story, a page turner, if you will. So by the time that people finish reading a well-written treatment, they can actually see your vision for this film. So the treatment is very important. The 10-minute work in progress, by the way, a work in progress can be longer than 10 minutes in the first phase. You can do 20 minutes of selects. You can do a 10-minute trailer if you want. Some people, if they're at that stage, submit a whole rough cut, although we don't get too many of those. So the work in progress can be, as long as you want, but make sure that whatever you submit, that it's really strong material, it's the best material, it gives an indication of what the potential of the program is. It's a sample. The treatment is kind of like the finished film on paper. The work in progress is a sample of that material, and together they go hand in hand, like hand in glove, to present a comprehensive package, if you will, of your project. So if you need more questions about the treatment, I believe that there is some information about how to write a good treatment, some pointers on the ITVS website. Okay, so I hope that, Enrique, that answers your question. If you have any more questions, Enrique, you can always email me. Okay, so let's see what the next question is. Is HDV format, high definition video format, acceptable? Does the HDV quotient of a project inform your decision at all? Well, we are basically now television, certainly public television is in the high definition era. And I'm not a technical person, but my colleagues in the production department have emphasized this, that we do want projects to be shot in high definition. That is the new standard. Not to worry if you've shot stuff, let's say you've been shooting a 10-year project and 10 years ago it was all analog. There's ways to convert that. But if you're just starting a project or you just started shooting in the last year or so, you should be shooting in high definition format. If you have more technical questions about format, what kind of camera and all that, just send me an email and I will forward these questions to the production department. Let's see here. We have another question here. It says, the question is, you only fund works in progress, correct? Yes. One of the mandatory requirements of open call is that you already have to be in production, if I understand this question correctly. So you have to have already started shooting. Our requirements are very minimal, though. I mean, you don't have to. You can submit only 5 minutes of a work in progress, and we will accept that. As I said earlier, you can submit as much as 5 minutes of material in your work in progress, all the way up to a full rough cut, depending on the status of your project. But yes, we only fund projects that are in production. The ITVS licensing agreement is a production licensing agreement, so you already have to be in production. We don't fund projects that are in development. Okay, next question. This question is coming from Benjamin. I think the previous question was from Benjamin too. Do selected projects have to have outside additional funding, or can they receive it all from ITVS? Okay, well, this is a two-part question. Let me answer this first part. When you come to open call, it's not required that you already have raised some money before you can apply to ITVS to open call. It's a good idea, but we understand that it's really tough to raise money for independent docs, and so it's not a requirement. So the answer, the short answer is that you don't have to receive any previous funding in order to be considered for open call. You can, if you haven't raised a single penny, you can come to open call and ask for all the money that you need to make your project, to complete your project. The second part to this question is, is there a monetary funding cap? In open call, no, there is not a cap. You should ask for all the money that you need to complete your film. So whether it's 200,000 or more than that, you have to. In fact, it's required that you tell us exactly how much you need to finish the film. We want to consider all projects and deal with the money later, because we're primarily interested right now in your ideas. We're looking for really interesting dynamite ideas for public television that we can get behind. So while the money is important, it's better not to be too concerned about, is this too much or is this not enough? Just make sure that you figure out your budget and then ask for the appropriate amount. Okay. Do we have any other questions? This is coming from Rodrigo. Let's see. How do you evaluate producers investing a large amount of their own money into the project? Does this put them at a disadvantage? Okay, if I understand this correctly, the fact that you as a director, as a filmmaker, a producer, have put money into your project, your own money, is not a consideration. We certainly don't require it. In fact, I personally would advise against using your own money if you can avoid it, because, as you know, doing a documentary is a very expensive proposition. We don't want you to start using your credit cards to fund your project. But it's not a consideration for us in terms of whether or not a project. Certainly doesn't put you at a disadvantage, the fact that you put your own money in. It doesn't put you at an advantage either. As I said earlier, the money part of this whole process in the early stages is important, but it's actually kind of secondary to the actual treatment and the premise and the things that I discussed earlier in terms of the actual content, program content. So hopefully that clarifies that question about using your own money to fund your, in the initial stages of funding your project. Okay, this question is from LD. Hi, thanks for having this Q&A. You're welcome. Happy to be here. Is it correct that we don't need to submit a line item budget, just estimates for the cover page? Yes, that's correct. In the first phase of the review process, you're basically doing a summary budget, if you will, and if you've seen the application, you'll see that it's just a few lines. We want to know how much money you've raised, how much money is pending, and how much money is left that you need to finish the film, and that's actually the amount that you would ask ITVS to consider funding. So it's only later, if you make it to phase 3, when we ask you to submit a more detailed budget. So next question. What is the length of the films that you fund? Well, they vary. In television, and certainly in public television, we have standard broadcast lengths. There are half-hour documentaries and one-hour documentaries and an occasional so-called feature-length documentaries, which run to 86:40, I believe. The standard length, though, in terms of what seems to be most suitable for broadcast, is either a half hour or 1 hour. If you are proposing if you're proposing to open call to fund, that you want money to fund a 90-minute documentary, that's fine. But the onus is on you to show us, to indicate and to justify that length. That's a long time for television. And so you need to make sure that when you present your materials, especially the treatment and a director's statement about why you think your story merits 90 minutes on television, it's important to make a note of that, okay? because it's much more challenging to program feature-length programs on television, especially on strands like independent lens or POV. Those series tend to be 1 hour strands. And so every time a feature-length project comes along, they need to make an extra effort to get all the stations to go along with putting in a 90-minute show. So half hour and 1 hour, those are pretty good lengths for television. And by the way, I might add that in Open Call, we don't fund anything less than a standard half hour. We don't fund shorts. So just be aware of that. Okay, here's a question from LD. What if the story evolves in the editing process? Are we locked into the story that we submit? No. I mean, we understand that the creative process of making a documentary is, a lot of things happen. You're dealing with real life after all. And the idea and the concept that you had in terms of the story and the characters, if you're doing a narrative, character-driven documentary, changes. And also, in terms of how the story evolves in the editing room is something that no one can predict. And that, of course, happens at the tail end of the whole process. So you're not locked in, so to speak, to the story that you submitted. Once you get funded for a project, we know that things change. However, I should caution you that once you are contracted and you decide that you want to tell a totally different story, let's say you proposed doing a story about homelessness in your city, and then you decided that no, you actually wanted to do something on immigration, then we would need to revisit that and have you submit new materials, because that's a real radical shift. But in terms of tweaking a story, and a story changing, evolving, let's say your main character drops out or something like that happens, we understand that happens. And when you're working with us at ITVS, we support you and help you to navigate through that process. So don't be concerned that that you're somehow that your ideas and concepts for the story early on are set in concrete, because we know that they do change. So next question, it comes from it says Brain. I don't know if it's Brian or Brain, if that was a typo, but maybe it's Brian. We're pushing our skills as documentary storytellers. So how big a deal is it to be able to do the, quote, sales work, end quotes? Big enough to have someone else do it? Or can the decision makers catch our vision through our lousy paperwork? It's an interesting question. When you say sales work, I'm not sure if you're talking about when you're trying to pitch, promote, and sell your idea to ITVS, or if you're talking about the finished project in terms of the PR promotion part of it. Let's assume that you're trying to get ITVS's attention on your story. It's pretty simple, but it's also really complicated, and that is that we're looking for really, really wonderful stories, hard-hitting stories, stories that will work for television, not necessarily for the movies, for theatrical, or for festival. Television audiences are the toughest audiences, as you know, but they're also potentially the biggest audience. And as I say, there is limited real estate on public television, so we want really, really strong stories that are going to have an impact on the audience. And so you, as the director, you have to convey your passion, your sense of urgency, your vision and your talent, your imagination within the pages of that proposal and treatment and in the work in progress. So all those skills are skills that you would use when you're making the documentary. So in the process of raising money, you're still using those same skills. You're telling a good story, a really strong story that will make a really huge impact on the decision makers. The paperwork that you describe as lousy, I know that a lot of directors always tell me, well, geez, you know, I'm a filmmaker, I'm not a writer, and I understand, I can sympathize, but one way or another, because you're going to have to figure out how to work with ITVS, because we do require a really strong treatment. People ask us, why do you put so much emphasis on the treatment? Well, because we may be the only organization in the country that will consider funding a project at 6 figures that is still in the early stages of production. And one of the ways that that helps us to make that decision, not just us at ITVS, but all of our colleagues around the country through the peer review process, is through the treatment. In the treatment, we get a very clear sense of your vision as a director, and as I said earlier, the finished film. So if you need help, in writing that treatment, then find someone to help you to write it, to convey your vision on paper. But it is very necessary. This is the way we work. Unlike other organizations, perhaps, that may require that you submit a full rough cut. We don't require a full rough cut. So given that, that's why we put so much emphasis on the treatment. Okay, this one is from Nick. Are projects who submit a rough cut, who are later along in production, at an advantage? Okay, so if you submit a rough cut, does that put you at an advantage? No. And we can see that in terms of, we actually did a search in our database over the last 2.5, 3 years, looking at projects that had made it all the way to phase 3 for panel review, you know, the finalists, and in terms of what the panels recommended and what got funded. And usually in the final phase, there's maybe 1, 2, sometimes 3 or 4 rough cuts among the 30 finalists. And we found that the rough cuts didn't necessarily get funded. The thing with a rough cut, and it's fine to submit a rough cut, is that once you submit a rough cut, it can go either way. People can look at that and say, wow, this person's well on their way to making a fantastic film. I can see it in the rough cut. Or they can look at it and say, yikes, this rough cut shows a lot of problems. It's all there right in the video, and they're not quite ready for funding. So once you submit a rough cut, it doesn't give you an advantage, and it basically shows you put all your cards on the table. And so I always tell people when they ask me, should I or should I not submit a rough cut? And I say, if you feel really good about that rough cut, even though we know it's a rough cut, or maybe even a very rough cut, and you feel good and you feel that this really is a strong indication of where your project is going in terms of the story, the characters, the production values, all that stuff, then submit the rough cut. If you're not sure, a rough cut can actually bring your project down. So that's the answer. There is definitely not an advantage to having a rough cut in open call. Okay, so next question. These are good questions, by the way. This is from Melinda. Applicants often have questions about the, quote, underserved audience, end quotes, part of the ITVS mission. Yeah, actually it's a very important part of the ITVS mission, audience. How can producers best address that question about underserved audience? And what should they think about in general when talking about audience? Okay, that's a really, really good question. This is actually one of my favorite topics, because one of the things I tell producers about ITVS, and specifically Open Call, is that ITVS was not established 20 years ago as a funder of independent projects. It was established to support independent docs that support the ITVS mission. Okay, so that's a very important distinction. And you should become acquainted with the ITVS mission. And a core part of that mission is serving underserved audiences. And the way, a good general way to think about that is, if you watch television, whether it's public television or commercial television, whose stories are being told, okay, and who's being left out in the representation of our society. When you think about how complex and varied our society is, and all the different communities that make up the United States, are all those communities' stories being told on television? And the answer is no. ITVS was established to get those untold stories out there, to tell those untold stories that serve specific communities whose stories are not, traditionally have not been told on television. And we have a very wide sort of interpretation of what an underserved audience is. Some of them are obvious, perhaps, such as ethnic or racial minorities. But we also look at things like people in certain regions, like Appalachia, or certain segments of, let's say, single working moms could be an underserved audience. But you have to make the case after you read the ITVS guidelines and you understand exactly what the ITVS mission is about as it relates to audience, then you need to fashion a really strong, persuasive case as to why your project really should be considered by ITVS as far as underserved audience is concerned. So please pay really close attention to that question when you're putting together your proposal, okay? Next question is from Alan. Since the treatment is a vision of the final film, do you have any tips for writing visually in the treatment? Whoa, that's a tough one. Like I said, I do 3-hour workshops around the country just on the ITVS treatment, because there's so many ways to approach the ITVS treatment in terms of trying to figure out how you can write an effective treatment. I think one thing that you have to really remember is that use action words. You probably heard this from high school, right? Don't write in a passive voice. You want to, it's almost like you want to grab the reader by the collar, by the lapels, and say, this is really a big deal story. It's going to get you really excited. You're going to be on the edge of your seat, and it starts once upon a time. You know, it's like when you know, your uncle or your mom or your dad used to tell you stories, and remember how you would get into it, and your eyes would get really wide. That's what you want. You want that idea that you're telling somebody a story that you can't wait to see on television. And so when you think about writing it, you don't want to write in a passive voice. You don't want to say things like, well, we're going to be interviewing Joe Schmo about the whole Homeland Security issue. No. No, you want to take the reader and drop them into the world of your documentary. And you do that by immediately getting into the action of the story. In some ways, if some of you who have worked in fiction understand that a treatment, when you're developing a screenplay, as I understand it, basically a treatment for a screenplay, and correct me if I'm wrong, is basically the story without the dialogue, right? So in this sense, the treatment for a documentary is basically telling the story in terms of what happens to the character or characters, if it's a character-driven documentary, and not all documentaries are character-driven. But let's just say that because we get so many character-driven documentaries, you want to introduce us to this character, get us to care about this character, and then tell us what happens to that character during the course of the hour. What sort of transformation does she go through that conveys all of the themes and ideas that you're trying to convey in that story through this person's journey or whatever. So these are things to consider. It's very hard to get into too much detail about the treatment because, as I said, there's many different ways to approach it and many things to consider. But my biggest advice to all of you is never use the passive voice. Use the active voice when you're writing the treatment. Okay, Enrique is back, and he has another question. How important is past experience from producers? Should they have previous broadcast experience? Okay, you know, one of the beauties of ITVS is that we will consider a filmmaker who recently graduated from film school, if you went that route, to people who who've been doing this for decades and have received tons of awards. We're interested in really, really powerful ideas first. Now, experience is important. If we look at your resume and note that you've never produced a documentary for public television, it's not going to keep you from being considered. But we might suggest, and you don't have to take that advice, that you might want to bring in an advisor or a co-producer who does have more experience, because as you know, putting together a documentary for public television is a very complicated process, and an advisor would be very helpful, or an executive producer. But again, it's not required. We do require a minimum amount of experience, which is basically that you have directed and or produced, or co-produced or co-directed a project for television. Or in some cases, if it didn't play on television, if it played in the theater. Because you have to, one of the mandatory requirements is that you have to submit a previously completed work that we can look at. If we're not familiar with you, we want to see what you've done in the past. So even just one, if you've only produced one documentary or a short, that's enough to get you in the door. I think there's a second part to this. If you like the film concept and the director, producer, creator has not published a broadcasted film, will ITVS suggest producers to work with? I think I covered that you do have to, it is required that you need to submit a previously completed work. It can be a 10-minute short, it can be a half hour. Whether it was broadcast or not is not so important, but you do need to have done something in order to be considered for open call. Okay, next question. Transmedia is an increasingly important consideration in all fields of entertainment. How should applicants address their transmedia elements in the proposal? That's a really good question, and yes, transmedia is a big deal. And at ITVS, we think of it as a big deal and are very supportive in helping to get producers to think about their transmedia ideas and strategies, and more it's become more and more a part of the open call process, as well as considered for other initiatives too. I would really advise you strongly to give us some sense that you have been thinking about this at least, or even developing some ideas. You don't have to necessarily have anything in place on the web, but it's important for you to communicate to ITVS through the peer review process that you have some ideas for your project that will be part of your multimedia strategy. You don't have to write a lot initially. Later, if you make it to phase 3, we'll ask you to write more about that. But it's a good idea to indicate to us that you're thinking along those lines. Maybe you've already done some webisodes, or you developed some kind of site that complements the broadcast, augments it in some way. Very, very advisable. Yes. Okay, next question. This is from Stefan. I have a project that is partially done. Do you do finishing funds as well? Well, actually, that is basically what the Open Call initiative is. It's a completion fund, finishing fund initiative. So we only consider projects that are in production, and as I said earlier, they can be at any phase of production. And so that's all we consider. We don't consider any projects that are in R&D or early development. We don't consider projects that are almost done. that are just, a picture lock, or you can't come to open call and ask for funds for sound sweetening or color correction. We want projects that are actually in production. Next question. This is from Felipe. Can you outline the review process for us? Is January 7th a postmark deadline, or do you have to receive it by then? We have to receive, let me start with the second question because it's very important, because the deadline is looming on the horizon. January 7th is the deadline. We have to have all materials in the ITVS office here. I believe it's 5 p.m. I hope it's 5 p.m. Maybe it's 5:30, but I think it is 5 o'clock. West Coast time, so we need all the materials in by then. The review process. Well, once we get all the projects in and they're entered into the database, and they begin, it would begin a process of internal review to select through the department, the programming department, to select the most competitive projects. So the first cut or first stage review is done internally. We do this in order to help facilitate the peer review process with our peers, your peers, around the country, who will be coming in second phase to review the second phase projects. So initially we look at all the projects and then make recommendations and have a discussion. We have 2 meetings a week apart and go over all the projects. All the material is reviewed. We review the proposal, the treatment, we look at the work in progress, we make recommendations. And out of those 2 meetings, which takes about a month after the deadline, we put together a phase 2 slate, and that's usually about 75 projects. So those 75 projects then are sent out to a group of readers from around the country. Three sets of readers, 3 readers in each group. So they each read about 25 projects. And these readers are public TV programming programming executives, filmmakers, and in some cases festival curators, an occasional person from academia, people who are very familiar with public media and the ITVS mission. And then a 4th pair of eyes is someone from the programming department, as well as our colleagues in the production department. They review the projects. Once that takes about a month. We get all of the evaluations. These are written evaluations that they do, and once we get those evaluations and we get the rankings, they're scored. Evaluations are written. From that, we put together a slate of the highest ranking projects, and that slate are the 30 finalists, and those 30 finalists are then sent out to a new group of people, the panelists, 7 panelists, who review all 30 projects and write evaluations, and then and they're only looking at the treatment. They look at the works in progress later, unless they're rough cuts, and those are assigned to 2 people to look at. But mainly the works in progress, most of the works in progress are looked in panel. The panel comes to ITVS and meets for 2 days. They deliberate, they look at the works in progress, they discuss, and they rank the projects, and after 2 days they recommend a slate. So that's the process. It's a long process. A lot of people complain, geez, it takes so long to get a decision. We know it takes a long time, believe me. We don't do it on purpose, but in order to be fair and transparent, and the peer review process takes a long time. Oftentimes we get in excess of 400 projects at a time in each call, and we have to go through all those projects to make sure that every project gets a fair reading. So that is essentially how it works. Okay, we have a question from a guest. Do you want us to include an additional discussion of the theme, format, structure, style, etc., in addition to what is conveyed in the body of the treatment. Yes, basically the theme idea, the theme is really basically the overarching idea that you're trying to convey. It's what I call the universal angle of a story. In other words, if you think about that all stories are local, just like, if you believe this, politics are local, all politics are local, all stories are local. And the theme, the thematic framework for a story is what allows it to cross over into a universal realm, so that a large, wide audience, a national audience, can relate to the story, respond to the story, because of these larger themes that you are exploring through this very specific local story. So theme is very important. Now, where do you talk about theme? Well, you decide that. We're not so prescriptive here that you have to discuss it at a certain point. I always say that you start to lay out the theme in the premise, and then you get into it more when you start describing the story itself, the theme, in the treatment. In terms of the structure, I said earlier that in the treatment you should say, okay, how are we going to structure the story? Is it going to be told in 10 parts, 3 acts, 5 acts? Is it going to be nonlinear, linear? So you have to sort of lay out some kind of a structure. It kind of helps to frame the whole story, just the way you frame a picture. You know, how is this story going to be contained within this structure? So structure is very important to talk about, discuss in your treatment. When you talk about format, I'm not quite sure if you're talking about video format or if you're incorporating film. Here's one rule of thumb. It's important, you only have a limited number of pages, right? So you want to really discuss the most outstanding stylistic, what you think are the most significant stylistic choices of your film. For example, I see many projects where directors want to incorporate animated sequences. So obviously this is an important thing to bring up. So if you're planning to use, maybe your main character is having nightmares, how do you convey that? Well, you as a director have decided that you're going to use animation to convey your main character's nightmares. That would be something for you to talk about a little bit in discussing style. And again, you can incorporate this into the body of the treatment, or you can have a separate, section where you talk about style. It's up to you. I actually, personally, I like to read a treatment that incorporates all the sorts of things in a sort of full court press approach. That's just something that I find interesting. But again, you can talk about structure and style in a separate section, and then focus and theme, and focus on the story, the narrative elements, if you will, in the treatment. It's up to you. Okay, so I think that's it. We're finished, and thank you all for participating and asking such wonderful and insightful questions. I hope they were useful, and good luck with open call. Oops, we have one more. Okay, maybe we were closing too soon. Oh, I see. We're going to take half a dozen or so more and then let Richard grab lunch. Oh, well, thank you. He's getting close to lunchtime. This is from Zara. What would you say is the most common and damaging mistake applicants make? Yikes. Well, okay. Boy, that's a loaded question. Well, here's one that might perplex some of you out there. But, in reviewing hundreds and hundreds of proposals every year, and they go into the thousands since I've been here at ITVS, that the director, when they put together the material and you read it, I end up scratching my head and not really understanding what the story is. And people say, well, that's so fundamental. Of course people should be able to tell you what the story is. But a story is not just this happened and this happened and this happened, the end. A story encapsulates a whole bunch of stuff, at least as far as ITVS is concerned. A story actually encapsulates a vision of something, as I said earlier, universal that is going to play to a large audience. And a story incorporates transformation for a character. It also conveys what I call a sort of approach that conveys multiple layers of meaning. All these things are so critical to the ITVS treatment. And I would say that these are the kinds of things that are missing in a lot of projects. I think that what happens is that, and it's understandable, that when an opportunity to apply for funds at ITVS comes along, people sometimes rush to get their stuff in without allowing for a sort of gestation period of their idea. The idea is a starting point, but once you think about it, you need to really spend a lot of time figuring out how that idea is going to translate into a dynamic story that's going to play on public TV. And that takes time, and it takes a lot of writing, rewriting, discussion, with yourself, talking to your colleagues about it. It's not easy. So I would say that would be the most important thing to think about, because that's where most projects fail. They don't succeed in conveying a real story that's going to work for public television. Here is a question from Elena. Do you provide constructive feedback for projects that you reject? Well, yes, we do, but only if you've made it to phase 2 and phase 3. Unfortunately, because we used to provide more feedback, but the staff time has been stretched so much that we're not able to do that. But we do provide feedback for projects who get to phase 2 and phase 3. And I would really, really encourage you to take advantage and avail yourselves of that feedback, because time and again, filmmakers have told me that feedback was really, really valuable in helping them to craft and develop and tweak and change their materials. So if you make it to phase 2 and you don't get into phase 3, don't despair. Make an appointment and get your feedback, and hopefully I think it'll be really helpful. So feedback is a big deal. Okay, this is from Sean. I'm an American, but I have a Brazilian co-producer. Can they be on the application as a co-applicant? Beyond that, is there any benefit to having a co-applicant? Well, let me take the first question. In order for anyone to apply to Open Call, you have to be a citizen of the United States, or you have to have permanent resident status. In other words, you have to have permission to work here, because the funds can only go to producers with those two types of legal status. If your co-applicant happens to be from another country, that's okay, but the money has to go to the main applicant. The funds have to go to the main applicant. Let's see, is there a benefit to having a co-applicant? No, I mean, it just depends on what your team is. I mean, I think the ideal team is to have a director. This is the vision person, right? The main creative force. And then a producer to deal with all the stuff that involves in putting, forth a large enterprise like producing a documentary. That way a director can concentrate on the creative aspect and getting that story and developing the story, and the producer can deal with all the other stuff, such as budget stuff, location scouting, all that kind of stuff. That's just my sense of what an ideal team is. Sometimes directors wear two hats. They wear the director's hat and the producer's hat, if you understand the distinction between those two titles. So it just depends on what your team is like. Because producing documentaries for public television involves so many, there's so many aspects to it, and it takes several months in order to get it, get it moving forward and off and finished. A director will often bring in a team, a co-producer, sometimes a writer. In some cases, they already sign up an editor, an associate. It just depends on what you want. But there's no requirement when you apply to Open Call to have a co-applicant. Okay, so we have another question from Kay. Do you review the DVDs on a standard DVD player or on a computer? I'm wondering if a QuickTime file on a DVD-R is okay. Yikes, these technical questions. Okay, we review DVDs, most of us review DVDs in our computer. We have Macs. And they play quite well. Sometimes, DVDs can be a little temperamental, and we have other ways of getting them to play in other types of playback, like DVD players. But most of the time, we review them on a computer. We can also review QuickTime files as well. I would suggest that you try to find the most straightforward way in terms of the format, so that you don't encounter any problems, especially when projects get sent out to various readers from around the country. We don't know what they're reviewing on, if they're using a DVD player or if they're using their computer. We want to make sure that those DVDs play well. One other thing too is make sure, please double check that, I know that sometimes people are sort of rushing under the big deadline, but make sure that when you put together your DVD that you look at it, make sure that it plays. Play it on your computer, play it on a DVD player, play it on 2 or 3 different formats to make sure that there are no glitches, because we frequently get projects and then the DVD for some reason doesn't play. Even if you play it on the computer, you play it on whatever, and that's problematic. So for obvious reasons. So just make sure you check those DVDs and make sure that they play. Oh, okay, so here's another question about the treatment. I love questions about the treatment. In the treatment, do we have to list the names of all the subjects to be interviewed, even though we're still casting? No. I'm not a big fan of lists, by the way. The treatment is not, a laundry list of we're planning to interview this person and this person and this person. That's not a treatment. No. As I said earlier, you're trying to tell a story. When you tell a story, you don't say, we're going to talk to so. No, you just start telling the story. Now, one thing let's say that you're doing a subject that is really complicated. Let's say it's a controversial subject. I talked about Homeland Security. Let's say you want to do an exploration of Homeland Security law and what impact it's had on our society, and you want to interview some experts. You can do that in a separate list. When you're writing the treatment, though, you should just go ahead and tell the story. In other words, who's going to be the main storyteller in your treatment? Is it going to be 2 people? For example, if many of you saw the award-winning documentary that we funded on Daniel Ellsberg and the release of the Pentagon Papers, if you saw that documentary, you know that the main storyteller was Daniel Ellsberg. After all, he was the main man. He was the main character, and the story was told, through his perspective, through his point of view. But in that documentary, of course, you had a multitude of other voices. You had people who represented the government, who represented the newspapers. All these different voices were part of the sort of cast, if you will, this chorus of voices, that you had one main storyteller. In the treatment, because again, you have limited time, you want to focus on your main character or characters so that people will get a sense of how these characters develop and evolve during the course of the hour, or in this case, with Daniel Ellsberg, it was a 90-minute. If you remember Daniel Ellsberg, we saw a person who went through some very profound changes as he became more and more aware of what the government, the American government, was doing in Southeast Asia. And through revelation, built on revelation, this character, Daniel Ellsberg, went through changes. And so by the time we get to the third act, he has gone, let's say, to the other side of this whole equation regarding whether or not the United States should be in Vietnam. So it was a very dramatic sort of evolution of the main character. If this is a kind of strategy that you're planning for your documentary, then you want to convey that. So you can't clutter with too many people saying, well, we're going to interview this person, this person, this person. You can save that and put it on a separate list. Okay, I hope these questions on the treatment, they're interesting. I know that they're complicated, but I think these are good questions. This is from Christine. Does getting ITVS funding guarantee a national broadcast? No. I mean, the thing is that ITVS, when ITVS is looking at projects through the peer review process, we want projects that are going to be on the national schedule, of course. But there's no way to predict that. Many of our shows land on Independent Lens or on POV. In some cases, they land on American Masters or American Experience, on Frontline. But there's no way of, in many cases, with many projects, you don't know where they're going to land. It just depends on how they turn out and what the response is from all these various strands. However, let's say that a show that we funded doesn't get into any of those strands that I mentioned. ITVS is committed to promoting that show and getting it on as many individual stations as possible. Sometimes other strands will pick it up. Not strands, what am I trying to say? APT or NITA. These are distribution arms that are alternatives to PBS, and they will pick up an ITVS show. So one way or another, once we funded a show, we are committed to going the full length to get it on as many stations in as many areas of the country as possible. But there is no guarantee of a national, what you call a national broadcast. It's going to end up on any of those major strands. The second part of this question is, do these shows end up only on public television, or can they go to HBO? No, ITVS is funded through the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and so Open Call is committed to, it can only show its finished shows on public television. It's different with international, and you can read about the international call because that's funded through different sources, not through CPB. But most of our initiatives are funded through CPB, and so they have to go on public television and not on commercial television, whether it's HBO or any other outlet. Okay. Oops, let's see, P.S. Here's a trailer for the film Richard was... Oh, you're going to see a little bit of The Most Dangerous Man in America, which was produced and funded through Open Call. Okay, I think...
We are going to win.
Quit making national heroes out of those who steal secrets and publish them in the newspaper.
I didn't get to say goodbye or anything. Suddenly it's like, it was over.
I think it's still on.
Oh.
There we go.
The hundreds of thousands we were killing was unjustified. Homicide, and I couldn't see the difference between that and murder. Murder had to be stopped.
This weekend, portions of a highly classified Pentagon document came to light for all the world to see and brought cries of outrage from Washington.
We gotta get this son of a bitch.
Yes, Kennedy did send in troops in violation of the Geneva Accord. Johnson did start the buildup before he said he was going to. These guys were lying through their teeth when they were talking to us. And here it is in black and white. There's no way of denying it.
The Times building is encircled by armed guards. We are printing tomorrow a top-secret government document.
A name has now come out as the possible source of the Times Pentagon documents. It is that of Daniel Ellsberg, the top policy analyst for the Defense and State Department.
Prepared to answer to all the consequences of these decisions.
Henry Kissinger said that Daniel Ellsberg was the most dangerous man in America, and he had to be stopped.
The study was 47 volumes, 7,000 pages. It would take me months of Xeroxing.
We've dropped another 200,000 tons of bombs on Indochina. That's 10 Hiroshimas, one Hiroshima a week.
What has remained significant about the release of the Pentagon Papers is the decision by a public official to give priority to conscience as compared to career.
Daniel Ellsberg, whatever his intentions, gave aid and comfort to the enemy.
It was a crime from the start, carried out by 4 presidents, and now a 5th president was doing the same. I'm not going to be part of this system of lying anymore. It wasn't that we were on the wrong side. We were the wrong side.